Hello there. So this is the last set of notes for this week 6 module. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about consumption and savings. So there's some reading out of chapter 13. I think it might be advantageous to just see the emphasis that I place on things before you dig into that chapter 13 material. So what I want to do is think about why are we talking about this, and then specifically link income, consumption, and saving, and then as systematically as I can, think about the things that influence consumption. So we'll have this list: income, of course, taxes, expectations, wealth, and real interest rates. So why are we doing this? Well, one reason why is just a practical matter. Consumption accounts for the majority of gross domestic product. So for most countries, it ranges from, say, the low 60% of GDP up to three quarters of GDP. Therefore, it's an important changes in consumption are an important driver of the business cycle. And as we'll see, the flip side of consumption, the decision to consume, is the decision not to save, and savings is an important contributor to long run economic growth. And we'll begin to see this a little bit even next week when we talk about chapter 14. The second reason why I want to think about this is that we're going to develop a model of the business cycle in chapters 18 through 20, where some of the material that we talk about today is a component of that. So specifically, we're working our way slowly but surely up to a model where to describe the behavior of the economy over the business cycle, as well as to analyze the effects of monetary policy and fiscal policy. We'll draw a picture where on the horizontal axis, we're going to have the output gap, which we've now defined. On the vertical axis, we'll have the real interest rate, which we have defined, and we'll come back to a little bit more systematically in the next week, in the next module. And then we're going to superimpose in this space two lines, one that we'll label MP for reasons that we'll talk about later, and the other is IS. And the IS line is going to reflect consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. So, in other words, the spending side of the macroeconomy. So, for consumption, of course, this is discussed in chapter 13. If you think about where are we headed, investment is discussed in chapter 14. Net exports are discussed in chapter 16, so we'll do each of those in turn. We don't have a whole lot to say about the relationship between interest rates and government expenditures, so we don't have a whole chapter devoted to that. But we will talk about fiscal policy as we develop that model. So what we're going to see is that the interaction of this MP line and the IS line are going to define for us an output gap. And that output gap then will help us think a little bit about the rate of inflation that the economy is experiencing. So, a second reason for talking about consumption is really to start to get the pieces of the model that we want to spend the most of our time with towards the end of the semester together. So, what I want to do is first of all think about what is consumption. So, consumption is household spending on final goods and services. So, this is exactly what we were talking about in our discussion of gross domestic product. We called it personal consumption expenditures, so consumption for short, and it's the C, in our characterization of gross domestic product. What I want to do is think about the economy's circular flow model. Remember, if you think about that, or you could go back and refer to it in the textbook or in the notes, we talked about the relationship between households and firms, and then also, sort of as a subtext, government and the rest of the world interacting in four big macroeconomic markets: the market for inputs, the market for output, the market, as we'll see, financial markets, and then in chapter 16, we'll talk about the foreign exchange market. So in our simplest version of the circular flow, we saw that households earn income from selling their inputs like labor or physical capital that they own, etc., to firms. Firms produce and sell output, which generates revenue that becomes the income for the household. So, this is what led us to the observation that we can think about real gross domestic product. And again, notationally, we use the letter Y as both the value of what's produced and sold, as well as the income that's generated in the economy. So, to bring this back to consumption, with income, households must do one of three things. They have to pay some taxes, so we'll assume that people are compliant in their tax paying. They can consume or they can save. So, we talked about consumption. Now, we can also introduce basically the flip side of this, which is saving. Saving is the portion of any after tax income that you set aside rather than spending. So if we think about trying to simplify all these words into a few symbols, we have income being allocated across these three things that households have to do: pay taxes, and then they can spend on current consumption, or anything that's left over afterwards could be saved. Notationally, we're going to use a Y for gross domestic product as our measure of income. Taxes will denote with a capital T, and consumption, of course, is the letter C. We've already seen that. And we're going to talk about several types of saving in the macroeconomy. So later on in chapter 14, which is what we'll take up next week. One source of saving is savings by households, and the textbook authors refer to this as personal savings. So this is what I want to, the reason why I have this notation here. Also, just as an aside, with taxes, we can also lump in here other transfer payments or subsidies that the government makes. So when we consider fiscal policy, we'll consider fiscal policy. Again, the policies that are conducted, say, in concert in an ideal world between Congress and the presidential administration, as changes in government expenditures, big capital G, or changes in taxes and subsidies, which we can lump into this T category. So what I have on this slide is just a reproduction of what was before. But now what I want to do is just re-express this a little bit, bring the T over to the left-hand side of the equation. And what we're left with on the left-hand side of the equation, or what we have as a result, is our measure of after-tax income. So after-tax income, or this is sometimes known as disposable income. And so what we're saying is, out of after-tax income, after taxes have been paid, whatever's left over can be devoted to current consumption, or it can be saved. So we can define a term known as the marginal propensity to consume, or the MPC, as the fraction of an extra dollar of after-tax income or disposable income that is devoted to additional consumption. So, for example, if you receive an extra dollar of after tax income and you run to the grocery store and you buy a large avocado that has a price of 75 cents, then that would mean that your marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. With every extra $1 of after tax income, you spend 75 cents of it. And of course, what that means is that you saved 25 cents, and we would say that your marginal propensity to save is 0.25. So the marginal propensity to save is the fraction of an extra dollar of after-tax income that's devoted to additional savings. We can put these two things together, again, with the reminder that with after-tax income, you can only consume or save. There are no other choices that are available to you. If you gave your money away, you would consider that as a form of kind of weird consumption. So the only things that you can do are consume and save out of after-tax income. If you dig a hole in your backyard and you put unused income in that hole, it's not productive savings, but that would be considered savings because you could dig it up in a future year and use those use those monies. So out of after-tax income, households can consume or they can save, and the decision to consume, therefore necessarily, is the decision not to save. And we'll refer to this idea again when we're talking about the role of interest rates in consumption. But for now, what I want to do is say, is point out what should be obvious, which is if you have an extra dollar of after tax income, it has to be split exactly between additional consumption and additional savings. And so we can define the marginal propensity to consume as in hieroglyphics, this thing. So, what is this saying in this box? We're saying this is the extra consumption or the additional consumption that occurs from having an extra $1 in disposable income or after tax income. And it is the case, I didn't say it in these notes, but now is a good time to introduce this, that the marginal propensity to consume is strictly 1 or less, and it is bounded below by 0. So with an extra dollar of disposable income, you could consume none of it, you could consume all of it, or somewhere in between for a fractional marginal propensity to consume. And similarly, then the marginal propensity to save is saying this is the extra savings that households undertake as a result of having an extra $1 in disposable income. So the same thing that's there. And so by definition, this is saying if you have an extra $1 in disposable income, it's going to be allocated between additional consumption and additional savings, where again, whatever these numbers are, the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save have to sum to 1. So in our previous example, we had the marginal propensity to consume was 0.75, the marginal propensity to save was 0.25, and that gave us this number 1. We will revisit this in chapter 18 when we describe, for example, how a $1 increase in government expenditures will impact total spending. And similarly, we can consider fiscal policy as well. How would a $1 tax cut impact total spending? And we'll tie it back into the marginal propensity to consume. So this is something that we will not be using for the rest of these notes, but we'll come back to later. When we think about from a measurement point of view, what is the economy's overall marginal propensity to consume, it is a reflection of a couple of things. So first of all, it's a reflection of all of the individual marginal propensities to consume in the economy. And the degree to which, at an individual level, we have consumers who are either, in quotation marks, consumption smoothers, or whether they consume hand to mouth. And so you'll see later on, I'm going to use H2M as my hand to mouth shorthand. The other thing that's going to determine the economy's overall marginal propensity to consume is whether a given change in after-tax income is anticipated or not anticipated. So expected or not, these are synonyms. So anticipated is expected, unanticipated is not expected. And whether any change in after-tax income is viewed or expected to be temporary or permanent. So, for instance, one of the COVID responses on the part of the US federal government was to have a $600 extra payment to people whose income fell below a certain level. That is something that correctly, most people viewed as being temporary. It was a one-time thing. There may be something similar to that that gets repeated, but not at the pace Congress is going right now. So, the contrast would be if something were legislated as being permanent. So generally, we think about, say, tax changes or the creation of a new spending program as being permanent most of the time. So, what I want to do first is to think a little bit about this distinction between consumers being consumption smoothers or hand to mouth. And so, what I want to do is just begin with the definition of this. So, hand to mouth consumers are those who live paycheck to paycheck. And I want to emphasize here, I am not making any kind of value judgment in this, in the use of this terminology. I don't intend anything. All I want to do is draw a distinction between people who, on the one hand, as we'll see, will have a higher marginal propensity to consume, and those who, on the other hand, will have a lower. So, why might somebody be living hand to mouth? Well, obviously, because they have lower incomes or poorer employment outcomes, sort of year over year. They might have low or no wealth. They could have poor or no access to financial markets for borrowing and lending, and this is going to be important. And so, why would somebody be low income or have poor employment outcomes or low levels of wealth and so forth? Well, those are really big epic questions that get into sort of the intersection of sociology and economics and politics. We could point to discrimination, we could point to outsourcing, we could point to um, imperfect financial markets. So lots of different things that we could point to, but that are well outside of the scope of what we're doing now and this course. Again, in the last set of notes, I mentioned, I believe, labor economics, which is Econ 380. If you are interested in some of these questions, they would be topics that you would take up in Econ 380. Final reason why somebody might be a hand-to-mouth consumer is more behavioral. So it may be that the person has the best of intentions about how to behave, but then doesn't follow through. So, for instance, somebody might say, "Oh, I've got some income. I intend to save part of it," but then they go walking down the street and they see this spiffy pair of new shoes and decide to have dinner out with friends and other kinds of things, and pretty soon their best laid plans for savings have run awry. So, in addition to somewhat more nefarious reasons why somebody might be living hand to mouth, like discrimination, it could also be the case that there's a behavioral aspect. So we're not going to concern ourselves with why, beyond what I've just said, why somebody is a hand to mouth consumer. But what I want to note here, importantly for this question of what is the marginal propensity to consume in the macroeconomy, a hand-to-mouth consumer effectively has a marginal propensity to consume of one. Every extra dollar of income that the household receives is going to go to additional consumption by definition. So it doesn't matter whether, we don't have to make this distinction about whether the extra dollar was anticipated or not, or if it's temporary or permanent. You get an extra dollar of income, it's going to be devoted to an extra dollar of consumption. So at the other end of the spectrum, in terms of consumption behavior, we have consumption smoothers. So why would we smooth consumption? We would smooth consumption, meaning we would try to even it out where we consume kind of the same amount all the time, unless there is a change, as we're going to describe here, to incomes, because we don't like abrupt swings in our consumption levels as income fluctuates. So, for example, many of us who work for pay get paid, biweekly or monthly. So in my case, I get paid monthly. On the 30th of the month, I get paid, and it's not as if on the first of the month I blow the whole wad on a big food, big meals and all that kind of stuff, and go shopping and all, and on and on, and then uh by the time the 30th rolls around, I have nothing left because of profligate ways earlier. That would make me unhappy. What we tend to see is that people want to have a predictable level of consumption to the best of their ability, a predictable level of consumption, day over day, month over month, year over year. So there is a discussion of why this is the case in section 13.2, which I am not asking you to read. You are not responsible for it. It is something that, if you were interested, you could read. And certainly in microeconomics courses, both at the introductory level and especially at the intermediate level, and in some of the applied courses in microeconomics, you'll consider this at length. So for us, what we're going to do is just say consumption smoothers are, so who are they? They are people with the following sorts of attributes. So they're careful planners and who hold themselves to a plan. So you make a plan about, or a budget about, how you're going to allocate your income, say over the month or the year, and as we'll see, over the lifetime, and adhere to that plan. Generally, as well, consumption smoothers are individuals who have good and reliable access to credit markets. And this is really important, as we're going to see in the next in 2 slides from now. So, what does that mean? That they have access to credit markets? It means that they can borrow or lend when needed or when desired. And so, then, as a practical matter, who are these people? They tend to be higher paid and or wealthier individuals in the economy, so that they and that's what's going to facilitate credit market access. So, what do consumption smoothers do? How do consumption smoothers act? Consumption smoothers are going to form an estimate of their permanent lifetime income. So you're sitting here at the age of 18 and you say, I got no income now. I'm a full time student. I'm going to graduate. I'm going to have my first job. Maybe it'll be, $50,000 a year. I'll have that for 4 or 5 years. Then I'm going to go to law school. That'll be a drop in income. Then I'll have a pop in income and so forth. So you're going to form an estimate of what your whole lifetime income is, including there will come a point at which hopefully you will retire and your income from work will be zero. So you might have income from savings, but no income from work. And so that would all go into this decision or this estimate of your permanent lifetime income. And you make a plan based on that about borrowing, so that when current income is below the permanent level, you're borrowing to maintain a consumption path. And when current income is above that permanent level, you're lending. And so this ensures or allows you to enjoy a smooth consumption path through your lifetime. So from a illustration perspective, this is what we're talking about. So as you go through your age, we won't label death in here somewhere, but what is reasonable to assume is that at a young age, you have less income, perhaps no income. So we're being relatively agnostic about where zero is here on the vertical axis, but maybe it's the case that well, whatever. And then you get out of college. So here you are, 22 years old, and you kind of get to, I don't know, 65, 70 years old. Those are your peak earning years. And what you would tend to observe is that when you are young, if you are consumption smoothing, you will borrow money in financial markets. And when you are older, you're going to spend your savings out of in order to ensure a consumption path in retirement, so that over the duration of your lifetime, the important thing here is that your consumption path is relatively smooth. And so in periods of peak earnings where your income is above your consumption path, you would be saving and potentially lending in financial markets. And then in the other periods, you would be borrowing or using your own savings. So what that means is that if we again we're going to try to depict for the economy as a whole what the marginal propensity to consume looks like, we would we would note that the marginal propensity to consume and the relationship between therefore consumption and income, and I guess correctly I should put in here after tax income, is going to depend upon whether you are a hand to mouth consumer or a consumption smoother. So, hand to mouth consumers, doesn't matter whether they get an extra dollar of income that's temporary or permanent, or whether it was something they anticipated or not. They get an extra dollar of income, they're going to consume all or most of that in additional consumption. So hand to mouth consumers have a marginal propensity to consume that's getting close to one, if not exactly one in the extreme. And for a hand to mouth consumer, knowing that at some point down the road your income is going to be higher is not going to have any effect on your ability to consume today. And so that's why we have here this idea that there's no change. For consumption smoothers, we see differing impacts on consumption as a result of changes in income, according to whether the change in income is temporary, permanent, anticipated, or something that's a surprise and going to happen later on in the future. So, what would be an example of this? So, a temporary rise in income. If you are going to get some income for, say, one time, so for example, the $600 payment that went to many people in the US economy late spring, early summer, that's something that was a one-time payment. If you're a consumption smoother, that's not going to affect your permanent income at all. Well, it will some, but not in a significant manner. And so your marginal, the impact on consumption is going to be relatively small. So again, consumption smoothers are consuming out of lifetime permanent income. So little blips along the way aren't going to matter. They're not going to matter a lot. Now, on the other hand, suppose it's the case that there's a permanent increase in income, then that's going to be something that's going to permanently raise your lifetime income. And so, as a result of that, then you would consume more in each and every period. So, we would expect that there would be a larger impact on consumption when changes in income are anticipated to be permanent, or when they are announced to be permanent. And then if we think about an anticipated increase in income, if it is what this means here is you're sitting here, say at age I don't know, let's say on average in the classroom, you're 19 years old, uh, you have an expectation or an expectation of your income when you're say 45. So what this is getting at here is, suppose you have an anticipated increase in income. That's going to be something that will have already been incorporated into your permanent income. So again, you're forward looking when you're a consumption smoother. So you're anticipating now that when you are in your 30s, you'll go to law school, you'll get a JD degree, and that by the time you're 45, that'll really have kicked in terms of higher income. That's not going to affect your consumption pattern because you've already anticipated it. News of a future rise in income, however, should be incorporated into your and future, we should say permanent, should be incorporated into your assessment of what your lifetime permanent income is, and that will affect your consumption immediately. So I think the best example, at least one that resonates with me, that makes me giggle all the time, is when I think about seniors. So I have the good fortune now of talking to a lot of seniors who are starting to finalize their post-WashU job plans, and happily, some of these things are working out for people, and inevitably, I'll talk to somebody who says, "Yeah, I know I've accepted a job offer. I'm going to go to such and so starting in July, and as a result of that, I'm going to take a fancy trip in over winter break, for instance." Now, of course, COVID and things, that's not going to happen this year, but more generally, or students will report, "Yes, I have a job that I'm going to turn to in the summertime," so they make very much more elaborate spring break plans. So that would be an example in which you are anticipating a permanent increase in your income, and as a result of that, you increase your consumption today. So the upshot of this is that the relationship between consumption and income, after tax income in the macroeconomy, is going to be determined by the balance of um, of or by the proportion of hand to mouth consumers versus consumption smoothers in the macroeconomy. And so that's what this last column is sort of getting at. We're not going to worry too much about that kind of stuff. We are going to note later on in what we do that there is a positive relationship between consumption and after-tax income, and with the understanding that if we needed to dig into some of the more microeconomic relationships more carefully, we could certainly do so. So what factors influence the level of consumption? Again, after-tax income. So the predicted change in consumption due to income changes is going to depend on what type of consumer is making decisions. But overall, we're going to think about there being a positive relationship between consumption and income. And in particular, one of the things that I thought that was interesting that we'll see when we get into chapter 18. So this is not that you should have read this now, it's not assigned, but I'm telling you we are going to get to this, is the idea that it's generally believed that reducing inequality, at least in the short run, can increase economy wide consumption and, in turn, as we'll see, reduce the size of an output gap. And so, why is that? Well, it's because people who have lower incomes tend to have a higher marginal propensity to consume. And so, if we redistribute income away from relatively affluent people, whose marginal propensity to consume out of an additional dollar of income is relatively low because they have lots of income and things that they've already done, towards people in the economy that have a higher marginal propensity to consume, then the net effect of that is that consumption will be higher. And this will be something that I think is an interesting application of the model that we're going to develop in chapter 18. Um, in terms of what I want to do now to also anticipate that model building is to think about the role of some other drivers of consumption: taxes, expectations, wealth, and then importantly, real interest rates. So consumption, of course, changes with taxes. We were talking about the idea that if we have an increase in taxes, that's going to reduce your disposable income and reduce current consumption, everything else equal. So we have an inverse relationship between tax changes and consumption. How much it changes is going to depend upon the balance of what kinds of consumers we have in the macroeconomy. And it means that studying fiscal policy changes can be really kind of fun and interesting. And we'll see this a little bit when we're in the material in chapter 14, and again as we develop the model in chapters 18 through 20. Expectations can also influence consumption. So, by expectations, we're specifically referring to optimism about the future. And we can think about measuring this in a variety of ways, but one way is with consumer sentiment indices. So, for consumption smoothers, if you feel confident that your income's going to grow in the future, then the estimate of your permanent lifetime income is going to increase. And so, that will tend to increase consumption today. And again, how big of an effect depends upon the balance between consumption smoothers and people who are hand to mouth consumers. On the whole, for an economy like the United States, we tend to see a higher proportion of households behave as if they are consumption smoothing than hand to mouth. And it's not to say that there aren't hand to mouth consumers or that I mean to marginalize them. I'm just looking at the macroeconomic impact. So, what we will say is that we tend to observe, consistent with this data, that when consumer sentiment improves, then levels of consumption tend to rise. And when the opposite happens, then consumption levels fall. So, you see the consumer sentiment index over here in the green, and consumption growth measured by blue. Greater wealth, obviously, as well, can lead to increased levels of consumption. Again, it's going to matter almost by definition for consumption smoothing individuals. So it is important to state loudly and clearly that access to financial markets and housing markets play a huge role in the level of current consumption. And just in terms of the if then sort of statement, when we have stock market booms or we see rises in home prices, we tend to see those individuals who benefit from those things feel more prosperous because their wealth has increased, and they tend to increase consumption. So we tend to see um, tend to, not always, see an economy's level of consumption rising when, say, the stock market is booming. And then finally, we have the effect of the interest rate and the real interest rate specifically on consumption. The real interest rate is an extremely important price in the macroeconomy. We'll return to the role of the real interest rate in each of the next two chapters in 14 and 16 to consider how it matters for investment and exchange rates. And then we'll use it, as we said, as one of the variables that we predict or describe with our macroeconomic model. So what was on the previous slide, and you'll see it again when I go back to it, is something that I want to emphasize, and that is that we can think about the real interest rate as representing the opportunity cost of spending. And how do we mean that? We mean that by recognizing that if you consume $1 today, then you can't save it. And enjoy the benefits of what? The interest income that you would get plus that dollar later on in a future period. So you can't enjoy the benefits of that dollar plus whatever interest income that you would get in consumption. Say next year. So if the real interest rate is, say, 2% per year, if you consume $1 today, you're giving up the opportunity to be able to consume $1.02 next year. And so that's the sense in which we mean that the interest rate represents the opportunity cost of spending. So all else equal, if we have a higher real interest rate, then this means that we have a larger sacrifice. So the higher the real interest rate, the larger the sacrifice in future consumption that you make when you decide to consume today, and of course, when you decide, and you decide not to save today. So again, when we think about the opportunity cost idea, it's really, really important. So this is a key idea. So we can think about the interest rate as representing a price that determines this year's spending. So aggregate expenditure, synonym here is spending. And we're seeing it now on the consumption aspect, or we will be seeing it on the consumption aspect. And in chapter 14, again, we'll talk about it with investment. Chapter 16, talk about it with net exports. And the other reason that the real interest rate is important is that it's a tool that policymakers use to influence the macroeconomy, and specifically what policymakers? Monetary policymakers. So we will talk about that in the context of the model that we develop in chapters 18 through 20, and then the subsequent discussion specifically in chapter 22. So what can we say here? We can say that if we have a lower real interest rate, then that's going to be something that we would expect would increase or boost consumption in the macroeconomy. And conversely, a higher real interest rate would do the opposite. So what I want to do is talk this through in words, and then in my own sort of boring pedantic way, write it out one more time, and then that's it for this set of notes. So for a given level of after-tax income, uh, lower interest rates do two things. There is a substitution effect. So again, lower interest rates discourage saving today and increase consumption today. So why is that? Lower interest rates today, and again, we're thinking about this in real terms. So lower real interest rate means that, or when there is a lower real interest rate, it means that you give up less, or you have a lower opportunity cost, in other words. So when the interest rate is lower, you give up less when give up less what? Less future consumption by making the decision to consume today. And so what's that the same thing as saying? That is the same thing as saying when the real interest rate declines, then it's less costly. Let's say it's less costly to consume today. In other words, you're giving up less in the way of foregone interest and less in terms of what you could be consuming in the future. And so, what's our basic, thinking about the way a rational decision maker operates? If something becomes less costly, you do more of it. So, what does that mean? So, that implies that we should increase consumption today and reduce savings, personal savings today. And again, all of this is holding fixed after-tax income. So we're saying if you have $1 of after-tax income and interest rates fall, you have an incentive to do more in the way of consumption and less in the way of saving. Oops. And so that's what we're saying, or that's what I'm saying here. There is as well an income effect. If you're a borrower and interest rates fall, then that means that less of your income has to be devoted to interest repayment, which means that you can buy more stuff. But if you happen to be a lender in the macroeconomy, then it means that your interest income falls, which can reduce your consumption. These two things are relatively small effects from an empirical point of view, because borrowers and lenders are people who are more likely to be consumption smoothers anyway. And so they're less likely to be impacted by transitory changes in interest rates. So while the net effect of this income thing could go either way, what we tend to observe is that the borrower side of the story tends to dominate. And overall, a lower level of real interest rates leads to a higher level of consumption spending. Similarly, if we were to consider the opposite, a higher level of interest rates, again, for a given level of after tax income, higher interest rates would provide an incentive to save more today and consume less today. We have this sort of other effect in here that, from an empirical point of view, is kind of small. And they tend to, and so what we tend to observe as well is that we see higher interest rates leading to lower levels of consumption. So, our basic conclusion, again, just restating the title on the slide here, is that when we see lower real interest rates, this is something that's associated with higher consumption levels and vice versa. And again, what I want to do is suggest to you that the reason why this is important is that we want to ultimately consider, say, a picture that looks like this, consumption and the real interest rate. Say there's consumption, right? An inverse relationship, higher interest rates lead to lower levels of consumption and vice versa. So R0, R1, C0 to C1, and vice versa. But what we want to do is translate this into this bigger picture where we have, again, the real interest rate on the vertical axis. Oops, nuts. The real interest rate on the vertical axis, but this downward sloping thing that we're going to call IS on the horizontal axis. Again, we're going to have an output gap. And that this is reflecting not only consumption, but also investment, government expenditures, and net exports. And so we have one little piece of why this IS line is downward sloping as a function of the real interest rate through what we just concluded. What our task next week is in chapter 14 is to explain, among other things, the inverse relationship between investment expenditures and the real interest rate. And our task when we get to chapter 16 is, among other things, to explain why there is an inverse relationship between the real interest rate and net exports. And then we'll put that together along with our story about government expenditures to get one half of this model that we're going to do. So again, we'll superimpose then another line in here and say all kinds of wonderful things about the business cycle. Anyway, thank you, and we'll be in touch with more exciting macro notes when we start next week's module.